Hello, everybody. I'm George from Ireland. I'm going to speak now about the attempted August coup in the Soviet Union in 1991. And I know I'm a bit late in talking about this, but I was very busy a couple of weeks ago when the 30th anniversary rolled around. And I remember one of my history dons saying, at a certain age, one becomes a historical document oneself. This is when he'd reached the age of 70. Now, I'm not quite there. But this is the thing is, as I remember it happening when I was a child, staying at my cousin's house, and getting up late as one does in the summer holidays, and my uncle coming back from work and saying he'd heard on the radio about this coup in Moscow. Remember, the Soviet Union was extant at the time. So what was the situation? Well, the Soviet Union was a union of 15 countries, Russia and some of her neighbours, like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Latvia, Georgia. I shan't name them all. And the Soviet Union, as such, had been founded in December 1922, and it was really built on the ruins of the Russian Tsarist Empire. Didn't include all of the Tsarist Empire. Some of Poland became independent, Finland likewise, but the great majority of it was what had been the Tsar's empire beforehand. Obviously, had a communist ideology, was a one-party state until right at the end. But in the 1980s, suffered severe economic problems. Much of the economy was based on oil exports. Oil prices were down. The Soviets had fought a unsuccessful war in Afghanistan, far worse than NATO's war, because the Soviets, I thought they admitted to 40,000 deaths. Isn't that right? Now, NATO suffered about 3,000 deaths in 20 years, as opposed to the Soviet 40,000 in 10 years. As the Soviet government told barefaced lies about just about everything, presumably that death toll was rather higher than what they're letting on. Although the defeat actually, in Afghanistan, it actually wasn't that costly financially in terms of their budget. And anyway, so they'd been transitioning to elements of capitalism. They'd unbanned other political parties in 1989. People were no longer going to be expelled from the Communist Party for being religious observers, and so on. And they'd allowed other Eastern European countries to democratize, because they were occupied by Soviet troops, and that's why they felt like ninepins, those communist regimes. And by 1989, they'd all become free countries. But the Soviet Union was there. I remember we were being told in 1991 that the Soviet Union, it will no longer be communist, but it will remain united. They'll all stay together. But in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, in 1989, some of them protested for independence, and they pointed out that one of the core myths of the Soviet Union really was a myth. It was false. They claimed that the Soviet Union had always stood up to fascism, and these people in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia pointed out that the only reason they were part of the Soviet Union is because the Soviets had actively collaborated with the Third Reich, and Nazi Germany had given them the green light. Yeah, you can go ahead and take over these three countries if you want to. Anyway, so the ruler of the Soviet Union was the General Secretary of the Communist Party. It was Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a reformer, who brought in elements of the free market, but by summer of 1991 was having second thoughts and sort of backpedaling, but it had taken on an impetus of its own, as in selling off some state assets. Some people like getting rich on free enterprise, but nevertheless, everyone's guaranteed a job. There were still price controls, but life in the Soviet Union in some ways was pretty dreadful. By the late 80s, nobody was starving, but you'd have just enough to eat. There were very few consumer goods. Their products produced were mostly quite rubbish, and you had very little choice in your life. But anyway, in 1991, some hardline communists felt they'd gone much too far, and there was a last-ditch attempt to save the communist political economic system as well as the unity of the Soviet Union, because in the Baltic republics, a lot of people were loudly agitating for independence. And likewise, in a place like Azerbaijan, some people were demanding independence. So Gorbachev took his customary holiday to the Black Sea, and he was there at a dacha there, his luxurious country house, when his house was surrounded and his bodyguards were overpowered. No one was killed, and so he was under house arrest. And something went on television, a broadcast from people who called themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency. So 8 men took control, and they assumed positions such as vice president, prime minister, and so on. That they weren't actually no one said to be president, and the head of the KGB, as in the Committee on State Security, that's the internal intelligence service, a bit like the FBI or something. He was on board with it. So they prepared for this. They'd released all the prisoners from a certain jail in Moscow, so they'd have plenty of room to accommodate more prisoners. They'd ordered tens of thousands of arrest forms, very communist bureaucratic thinking that they couldn't have a coup d'etat without arrest forms, rather than just simply having people arrested. Doesn't matter if you fill out a form or not. Anyway, so these 8 people, so they wanted to preserve the old system, and they thought that Gorbachev was a disaster. So at 1 o'clock in the morning, on the 19th of August, it went ahead. Anyway, so they had Gorbachev there. Obviously, the media was all state-controlled. They were controlling the narrative, putting their message out. Anyway, but within the Soviet Union, there were various republics. Russia was one of the Union republics, the biggest one. But the president of the Russian Republic was not the president of the Soviet Union at that time, was Boris Yeltsin. So Yeltsin refused to accept this. But the broadcast on television by the State of Emergency Committee said that Gorbachev has been taken ill. He's had to be relieved of his duties with immediate effect. Now, that's quite plausible. He was, a man in his 60s. That could have been true. And people's health can suddenly take a turn for the worse, notably when there was sort of a coup in the Politburo in 1964, when they'd pushed out Nikita Khrushchev. The same thing had been done. They'd announced to the public that he's been taken ill, and so therefore he has to stand down immediately. And the public don't need to be told the nature of the illness. There's medical confidentiality. So various tank divisions are brought into Moscow, and paratroopers and so on, in case there were protests, to be able to clamp down on that. The plotters had considered arresting Boris Yeltsin, whom they thought was dangerously liberal, more liberal than Gorbachev, which he was at that stage, but they didn't. So Yeltsin organised protests. There's the White House in Moscow, as in probably the house of the Russian government, and that's where Yeltsin took his stand. Anyway, I don't want to go through a blow-by-blow account of everything which happened, but the army and the Air Force wasn't completely on board. So this state committee on the state of emergency, they'd cut off communications between some military units when they didn't completely trust the commanders. And Yeltsin, he gave speeches to huge crowds. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Moscow, walking in streets often silently, but to send a message that, no, we're not going to back down, we're not going back to the old system. And so what do you do as the coup plotters? Do you open fire on them? Or you could threaten to open the fire on them? Or what if they don't get off the street? Do you shoot or not? If you do, you're a butcher, and if not, well, your coup's not going to succeed. So they didn't take, I suppose, the brutal action they needed to quickly enough before the crowds were too big to be controlled, and then it was just too many people for them to shoot these latter-day Stalins. Anyway, and so some of the military units that the coupsters had organised ordered to be here or there defected, went over to the side of Yeltsin and what they felt the ordinary Soviet people who didn't want this putsch to succeed. Estonia, one of the Union republics, declared its independence on the 20th of August, the second day of the coup d'etat, which was the precise opposite of what the coupsters wanted. They wanted to maintain the unity of the Soviet Union. What do you do? The coup was really falling apart in 1921, and Yeltsin was always speaking out against it. There was foreign media. Some of the state media actually began broadcasting his statements and things like that. And some government ministers declared their neutrality in all this. I remember the Soviet ambassador to the Republic of Ireland. He loudly spoke up in favour of the coup d'etat. 2 days later, he completely changed his tune and said he'd always been against it. It was hilarious to watch. Maybe that's all who thought he was going to win. Anyway, the KGB, they then released Gorbachev, who flew back to Moscow in the afternoon of the 21st of August to take control of the situation again. And really at that point, the coup d'etat collapsed. There had been 3 men who'd been knocked out and killed by a tank on Novy Arbat Street in Moscow. So the only 3 people killed in the whole thing, I think. So the coupsters, 8 of them were arrested. One of them quickly committed suicide. The others faced jail terms. They had their trial the following year. Most of them were pardoned or else released after a very short period of time. So that was it. That was their last-ditch attempt to save the Soviet Union, which failed. But within days and weeks of that, all the Union republics had declared independence. After the failure of the August coup, some people thought, okay, well, maybe some of them will go independent, like the Baltics or the countries in the Caucasus, but certainly Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus shall remain together. Well, that proved to be mistaken. And really, Yeltsin was the man of the moment. He's the one who's remembered for standing on top of the tank and giving a truculent speech saying, we're just not going to go back to that oppression. So Gorbachev, he stood down on Christmas Day 1991. By that time, it was agreed, there was a treaty signed between Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. They recognized it dissolved. So they had their treaty that they were going to cooperate with each other. And that was it. The Soviet Union was over. And on the stroke of the midnight hour, on New Year's Eve, 1991, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and the Russian tricolour was hoisted. And that was the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Olympic team had prepared for the Winter Olympics in February 1992, held at Albertville, France, and they went ahead and competed as the Soviet Union, since there was insufficient time for those newly independent states to organise separate Winter Olympic teams. So that was it. It was a spectacular failure, and it brought about the exact opposite of what the Cousins had hoped. Became a multi-party state. The Communist Party was even briefly banned in the early 90s. The Western countries like the United States had very much wanted the coup to fail, were totally on the side of Gorbachev and then indeed Yeltsin. Gorbachev became president of the Soviet Union, its first ever president, just for the last couple of months of the Soviet Union's life. There had been other heads of state with other titles, like chairman of the Presidium and so forth. Anyway, that's enough from me. That is about that August coup. And you can go to places which is significant, particularly the White House in Moscow. Okay, bye.